I'll call this meeting to order. Developing meaningful relations with our Indigenous neighbors is a priority in the Northern Rockies Regional Municipality. As such, we are collaborating with First Nations governments and Indigenous organizations to develop a respectful and meaningful territorial acknowledgement. This work also presents an opportunity to learn more about the culture and history of the Indigenous people of our region. Please be advised that today's meeting is available for the public to attend virtually, is being streamed and recorded. Can I get a motion, please, to adopt the agenda? Moved by Councillor Andrews, seconded by Councillor Souls. All those in favor? Carried. Today we're welcoming Jeff Clancy, our CO, Daryl Struthers, Conservation Officer Inspector for the Peace Liard region, and Brad Lacey, Senior Section, Conservation Officer Sergeant for the South Peace Zone. Gentlemen, today we have with us Ms. McIver, Mr. Berry. We have our Fire Chief and Bylaw Enforcement, Mr. Childs, Ms. Thompson, and Ms. Shepherd, and we have Mrs. Laval, as well as Councillor Souls, Councillor Goering, Councillor Andrews, and myself, Mayor Gary Foster. It is good to see you today, and want to welcome you here today. We've had some concerns in the community regarding some bears, as we often do throughout the year, where people are concerned about the safety of their children. And that's why we've invited you here today to discuss some of the conservation officer procedures and how we might try to allay some of the public's fears as far as bear sightings, bears in our community, and as well we can address also some of the techniques to reduce bear incidences in our community. So I would, without further ado, turn it over to yourself and allow you to speak to those concerns. Mr. Clancy, would you like to begin?
Sure. I mean, we'll start off with anything in particular that concerns the public. I guess you mentioned safety. We have addressed this in the past.
Mr. Clancy, I'll just ask you to get a microphone there. Oh, you've got one? Okay, good. Thank you.
Just with regards to safety, I mean, it always comes back to proper attractant management. We've addressed this in the past, that Port Nelson in particular has some issues with garbage management. The main attractant, we do have some statistics that we can show that garbage is our main attractant. Later in the year, it would be fruit trees. So I mean, we push that to the public to always be managing attractants, and that will keep, you know, more bears from coming into the community, prevent that. I mean, we collaborate with WildSafe, as presentations have been made to Mayor and Council before, where efforts are being made to manage those attractants and educate the public. So there is a lot of hard work that's been going on behind the scenes with regards to that. While we stress to the public to call the RAP line, that's how we monitor when bears are in the community, at what stages of habituation or food conditioning those bears are, so that we can monitor that and take action if necessary. So I mean, I don't know what else to say to kind of reassure people that they are safe. We just have to learn to coexist with these bears, because they will be in our community every year, right?
I think one of the things, if I look back at past history of the Northern Rockies, we have had some bear-human interactions that have resulted in the deaths of some people in our community. And of course, when people have young children that are playing in their yards or on their streets and everything else, and you know, they have some concerns that there is going to be a bear interaction and it could end badly. And you know, so I think some of these techniques that we utilize to keep fruit trees, you know, pick the fruits quickly so that you know, bears aren't attracted in the fall, and ongoing through the summer to make sure that garbage is you know, kept in containers and it's disposed of responsibly, so that we don't have attractants for bears. But we still have them, and you've seen them many times throughout the summers come into our communities and present a problem to the citizens, where people are frightened of the bears, and they want these bears reduced. I think you've seen the videos on Facebook, et cetera, where bears get in the backyards, on and on. So just to speak to some of those issues. I think it's crucial that the conservation officer, first of all, educate people, bring these, show people the importance of getting rid of garbage in there or keeping bear attractants away from bears. I think it's hugely important. And maybe some education around, to reduce the amount of fear that people have of bears in our community. You're right. We are in an area where there's bears constantly in the area around Fort Nelson. They do from time to time come into the community, but I think that's important. Any of the other conservation officers like to speak on the subject?
Yeah, thank you for having us here. From my perspective, being in charge of the entire region, I've always taken the tack that all levels of government have a shared responsibility for public safety. So including the Northern Rockies municipality. So, we need to work together in partnership to solve some of the problems and to sustain momentum that we gain. We work closely with the Wild Safe program staff. I know you have involvement with that program as well. I know that through that program, there's been a bear hazard risk assessment done that's identified some of the issues within the community and some of the things that can be done to mitigate those. And I think we need to work together on actually implementing those things for a longer term solution. And it can't just fall to the CO service. You have a role in public safety, and we're more than happy to work with you on that.
Thank you. Mr. Lacey.
I'll second that aspect, but even within the aspect of tools that are available to folks, right? So I know, and I'm getting up on the history of Fort Nelson and stuff. I've been in the region for like close to 20 years, so I've always had a bit of an understanding of Fort Nelson and some of the aspects that happened here and some of the history with like BRP program and et cetera. But the one thing I was really pleased by was the changes that have been incorporated under bylaws within the municipality. So I understand that you do have a fruit tree bylaw for picking up. I think it's 3 or 5 days on hitting ground. Positive there. I understand that there's been some retrofitting of municipal trash cans that have been brought online. My understanding is about 50% have been deployed within the community. And I think those locations were identified through Wild Safe and as well as with the CO service as the high frequency or maybe problem locations, or which are typically around corridors, right? So, town management, how the town itself is laid out, what green belts allow wildlife to move through, typically those are going to be those spots where people will be having their walking trails, right? It's no different. Tumbler Ridge is a community that I watch over out of the southeast, and it's similar aspects of it, right? Is that interactions and people recreating and wildlife being around. But the one thing I had with the trash cans I was curious about is the 50% deployment and how that works. Like were they set to like along that line of the corridor and those interactive areas with bears, or was it another choice of how they were determined as to location?
I'll let Mr. Barry answer this.
Picking the memory here a bit, but the understanding was this was an agreed upon area between Wild Safe, Jeff and the group, and our team. And we had a certain amount that we retrofitted. As one component was attempting to get them actually classified as a bear resistant bin, which weren't successful last year. But either way, there still takes a bit more effort to access them if you're a bear trying to access what might be in there. That said, the bins were identified for a certain area around that corridor, Gardner Crescent area, I believe. Been a couple. And the
They were offered to
They were offered, but
people
everyone-
that
not everyone
couldn't
accepted.
properly store their
Yeah.
bins in a safe manner. So
Yeah.
they were offered. I don't believe everybody took them, but I think there was a pretty good uptake from those people that couldn't safely store their garbage. So they were offered there first.
So yeah, and we didn't get the uptake that we thought we would get. So they're doing a second round now. The most recent meeting with the service and our group was to go again to some other areas and including that and offer it up and make it the process or the program a little bit easier accessible. So we would basically drop that bin off, take their other bin, reduce any hurdles that they might have, the homeowner to be part of the program.
So the hazard assessment that WildSafe was working on identified those high conflict areas, Tamarack, Gardner, those subdivisions that are right along green belts where bears are quickly accessing garbage. Once we identified those high conflict areas, that's when we got that bin tested. Doesn't need to be bear resistant, just needs to bring down conflict numbers. So we stuck with that design, and I think, like you spoke with, a number of residences wanted the bins, some didn't even respond. And now, some of those bins were just sitting stagnant, not in the community. So in discussion with Sean and WildSafe, we identified some more residences that could get that bin. And now I don't know how many have gone out now, but the people that are getting those bins, they don't have any storage means to store their garbage properly. Everybody else, their garbage bin sits right out front of the garage. It's very easy to move their garbage bin right to their garage. So those people right now are not a priority for that deployment. So that's how that kind of laid out.
Thank you. Are there any other questions for the conservation officers? Councillor Gerwin. Oh, Councillor Souls.
I just want to talk a bit about the concept of shared space, the idea of shared space. And I know that we worked on the issue of having fruit trees managed well, and that's, as a farmer, I think managing your crops is a good idea. And I think that is one of the things that we run into in the fall. But as far as shared space, we have problems in the community. We have people, I worked at establishing community gardens quite a few years ago, and I still participate in preparing gardens and helping them go. There's quite a few people who have tried gardening and they're not interested in gardening anymore because of the wildlife interactions take place. Partly the deer are more likely to come and eat your above ground crops. The bears also there's a couple of places where the bears can frequent occasionally in the Midtown. They've been there a couple of times, but regardless, the idea of shared space is that I take issue with the idea of reducing fruit trees and so on. And from a food security point of view and from a community garden point of view, I'd love to see it if we were all growing 10 times as many fruit trees and 10 times as many plots in the gardens. I say that because that's a value also that society has all over the Western world, and the idea of growing your own food is getting to be a greater and greater interest among people. And so I think that should be encouraged. But here it just leads to the point where you actually have to have a discussion over whose garden is it? Is it the bear's garden or is it my garden? Is it the bear's fruit tree or is it my fruit tree? And whether the issue of access to my fruit tree from a bear that I don't want to have there, if I'm depending on my fruit tree as part of my food source, the bear, that's not shared territory anymore. It's actually my territory. And the bear has no jurisdiction in that. And so I think that as when you talk about the levels of government all participating together, municipalities have the ability, as a bunch of people that, let's say we all had the opinion, we have the ability to say, well, we are not going to put up with having bears in certain parts of our community. We can draw a hard line. You just like you do, you lock the door on your house when you go in at night because you're actually putting up a hard boundary on where access is optional. I mean, you get to decide whether you open your door or not. I think in the same way in the community, we have that option of saying no bears allowed when the pressures get there. It's just the conversation around shared territory and putting up with each other is a discussion that has to come. The more food related production that we have, the greater the conflict over shared space is. So.
Councillor Gerwin.
Yeah, so I mean, you all have a hard job, like a really hard job. Like I think all of us here understand that. And I didn't think that this meeting was going to be putting anybody on the spot to, you know, I hope that's not how it's coming across. That's was not how I had intended it to be anyways. I really like the comment about it's a shared responsibility, and that's where I was trying to come from at the last meeting that we had, in that the province and the CO service have their mandate, and they have to follow the rules and the regulations that are outlined to you by your governing body. And the NRM, like this is how I see it anyways, the NRM has to agree with that, but we might have the possibility to go a step or two further, right? So if the CO service has to respond to bear encounters as your matrix that you have presented a couple of times to council now, that if this happens, then this is what you do, and that whole matrix. If that isn't, if we're not happy with that, then we have to figure out within ourselves what we can do legally, what we can do, and what kind of a service that we can provide. And that's where I was coming from, in that CO in the province has their job, but I think that we have our job too. So I was glad to hear that you feel somewhat the same, in that it has to be a shared responsibility. So if it's important for us and our residents to have backyard gardens and fruit trees, and then how do we coexist with, so that everybody is working together and we're not fighting each other, and it's our fault or your fault or the garbage fault, or, you know. And so that's where I hope that we can get to, because I think like this is my 8th year now, and this has been an issue for me right from the beginning, in trying to find a way that we can all work together to ensure that our community is as safe as it can be, while we can be outside enjoying nature. I mean, this year's a little different because the mosquitoes are keeping us at bay. And if there's anything you can do about that, we could maybe work together to figure that out too. But yeah, yeah. So that's where I'm coming from anyways. I'm not pointing fingers or blaming or saying that anybody isn't doing what they're supposed to be doing. And coming from a resident point of view, it's like, you know, like I've had any number of people say, I'm not phoning the RAP line because then I get ticketed. Well, put your garbage away and you won't get ticketed. But on the other hand, you know, like I have a neighbor that maybe is not taking care of their garbage. What do I do about that? Do you know what I mean? It's like I'm being held in a situation where it's an attractant for the bear, right? So pitting neighbor against neighbor doesn't work either. Pitting neighbor against ones that have chickens that are attractants, or gardens that are attractants, for fruit trees that are attractant. Like there's a lot of attractants. And so how can we figure out how we can provide the most safe community that we can?
Councillor Andrews, do you have any comments?
Just from what I hear is what I think not everybody, but the majority of people talking want is, when they call the RAP line, they want someone to show up within 5 minutes to scare the bear away. And it's trying to figure out a balance of how can we have a service, maybe like conglomerate of people who could possibly do that, right? Like it doesn't have to be COs, but maybe the assistant from the COs in training. Maybe if we could get a group of people that are willing, like a neighborhood watch, that band together and scare off the bears. Because I think the more you scare them away, the less likely they will be to come back. But just kind of.
Inspector Struthers, do you think there's anything else the Northern Rockies can do specifically in concrete terms to reduce the number of bear people interactions?
Well, I always believe with every problem, there's a solution. and I believe every problem's an opportunity, right? And I think this meeting is the start of an opportunity for us to work together at finding the solutions. You know, sometimes being in leadership positions, we have to make hard, tough calls, right? And so I think there's some opportunity for us to talk about, you know, how garbage is managed in the community, whether or not garbage cans are optional or mandatory. There's opportunities, I think, for us to talk about some of the fruit trees that were planted historically, like the choke cherries and the crabapple trees, and whether they're in a good location or not. You know, if the community wants to have community gardens and promoting fruit trees, there's no reason why we can't do that. But we also have to take some measures to reduce the conflict between bears and humans at the same time, right? And there's other communities around the province, the Okanagan. You know, I was stationed in Terrace and Kitimat for nearly 9 years. Like, that's fruit country, right? We had a lot of our conflict was with fruit trees, and you can manage it. It takes a little bit of work though, right? But if we work together, I think there's a solution. So I think it's great that you're involved with the Wild Safe program. You know, I think there needs to be a little bit more engagement there. My understanding is that you don't necessarily receive regular reports back from that working group. And I think that's important, that you're aware of actually what's going on, what's being done, and having an opportunity to maybe provide some input in the direction and what you want to see going on there. And same as for us, Jeff sits on that, representing us. So I think, as you know, both of us are informed, you know, we can look at finding the solutions.
Thank you. Are there any other questions for any of our conservation officers? Councillor Gerwin.
Well, I have you here. So we have an environmental advisory committee for the NRM, and one of the recommendations has been to expand our vermicomposting project. So do you know what the vermicomposting project is? No. So we take care of all of our cardboard and our organic material using worms at our landfill. So we're kind of looking at how we could manage to remove more of the organics from our weekly garbage, right? Without causing more of a problem for the bears, right? Because I mean, on the one hand, if you remove the organics from the garbage, then bears are not going to be interested in it. But then it has to go somewhere that doesn't become an attractant for the bears. So if you have any ideas about how we could, for next steps, I would be very interested to hear.
I guess we should add that is that there is a company that does collect those organic waste. Ariana's company, right? And Hillary can probably speak to that, but amazing, right? That's diverting all that waste straight to the vermicompost. I mean, you definitely have to look at safe storage options for that, because now you're separating organics, especially if we get bear bins and now the organics are just taken and put it on a silver platter for them. Area has some rules within our company that go to that, speak to that. So, but yeah, I love the program. I love both those programs. Yeah, the storage thing is the biggest. Store it properly and intelligently and get it to the area that's fenced in, right? The vermicompost is now electrified. So, I mean, that's safe storage as long as it's monitored. And yeah, that's my input, what I've seen in the community.
Thank
you. Pardon me.
ahead.
I'll add that as well. I just happened to come back from Vancouver Island at a community called Port Alberni, and that's what they've done. So you have your household waste, and then you have an organics, both of which are cable clipped, right, with the augmented framework, and that's been a high success there from what I can see anyway. And then there's literally a recycling bin, but then you got to have that infrastructure to take care of all of that. And if there is a program already in place, that is awesome for the size of community, right? Yeah.
Another one's just getting buy-in from everybody, right? I don't know, Ariana's stats, how many people she has on that program, but having everybody involved. Because I have not seen many of those green bins out around that Tamarack Gardner area where we have those high conflict areas. So
And those bins are not bear proof. So that's my concern. It's
which all the
Right.
green ones.
the little green ones, right? So if you're storing your organics weekly for a week in there, it's pretty stinky, right? I personally put mine in the freezer, take it out in the morning, but not everybody has that option, right? And so those green bins, when the program expands, that's going to be a huge attraction for the bears to come up during the middle of the day, because all the great green bins are going to be lined up out there waiting. So we're very aware of that and need to come up with some solutions before we expand it.
There actually had been and I guess it was just a solution that came up. I think it was Farrell, Yukon. And I wouldn't say it's necessarily just for organics, but they'd have like a large bin at the end of the street. And I'm
Right.
not saying they got long streets in Farrell, right?
Yeah.
But I've never been there either. But maybe that becomes something. If it's a small size composter that you can take the organics in, that you can take down and dump into a centralized spot, it might make it easier for people just to have it in a spot. There, what do you have to do? Then you ensure that container is bear proof, right?
Yeah,
The-
that's what we have at the landfill. So it's behind the electric fence and everything. So
Yeah, and sometimes I know in Prince George they came up with and I haven't seen your municipal trash cans yet, but I suspect it's just the automated where you can pick it up as you drive by. And so there was a certain spot in Prince George that I recall I was having issues with bears on garbage, and it wasn't a huge. Yeah, I wouldn't say it was a huge outlay, but there was somebody came up with, I don't know if it was the city of Prince George or whatever, and a different size community for sure. But Mackenzie did something very similar. And it was just simply a ratchet strap. And if you have the bar across the back of the lid, you put two hooks, you run one hook, you go down through where the arm would pick, and then you come back up and over. So all you're getting is like a triangulated support on that lid. And it has proven to be somewhat successful, right? I wouldn't say 100% because you're always going to have that one animal that'll figure things out. But the other aspect that I know with Jeff and some of the numbers that we were getting is Wild Safe has their, I forget what it's called, their watch list, or where you can put a sighting of a bear or whatever. So I mean, what comes up on that for numbers versus what numbers we get versus what numbers are perceived to be on social media, which we don't watch, right? That's not the reporting way. You wouldn't report a theft or an assault through social media. So grain of salt with the social media stuff. The ironclad stuff is what actually physically gets reported. And you say if people are apprehensive to do it, that could be just more education aspect. But I mean, the idea that your neighbor's doing it and you feel awkward, because that is an awkward situation. It can be a phone call to local bylaw if that's a bylaw issue. If it is something that's more of a dangerous wildlife protection order aspect, then that could come too, right? And it's just a drive-by. If we drive by and we know that that's probably going to be the neighbor who's the suspect because of whatever is there, that's an easy stop and talk, right?
yeah.
I would just note that any reports to our bylaw or to you are anonymous anyway. I mean, you're not going to tell the people you're investigating who filed the report. So, and neither does our bylaw officer. It's just standard procedure amongst every level of law enforcement. Mr. Clancy, what you were alluding to, that, you want to get buy-in from everybody. As we know, 90% of people will comply with reasonable rules. Then you'll always have the 10%. And we try to use as much carrot as possible. And then you need bylaws and enforcement for that last 10% of stick that you have to use. And that's unfortunate, but there are some people in our community who just, like any other community, don't want to go along with what the rules are, even when they're reasonable. Councillor Gorwin.
Yeah, before all my neighbors phone me to, I was just using that as like a what if example, like, so all my neighbors, it's okay. I wasn't talking about you personally.
I believe it was a general comment on the state of society. Are there any other questions for our conservation officers? Gentlemen, I will thank you for coming here today and speaking to us, and we will take some of your suggestions to heart, particularly about reporting back from WildSafe so that we can make our community that much more bear resistant, I guess, and look forward to having no human bear conflicts in the future, because I know there are a concern in our community. Thank you. Moving on for administration report number 49, animal welfare service procurement for discussion. Ms. Shepherd. Safe travels, Mr. Clancy.
Hi, Council. So this report is intended to provide some background information related to animal welfare challenges that we've been navigating in efforts to facilitate a conversation to really dial in on the optimal animal welfare services contract for the next year in February, when the other contracts are expiring. Additionally, as Council is very much aware, there's been a lot of discussion over the last year plagued to concerns with bylaw enforcement capacities, primarily in areas such as wildlife attractants and property maintenance bylaws. So it's thought Council may wish to investigate opportunities to include additional bylaw enforcement services, either within the revised animal control contract or possibly developing a new opportunity. So Council direction is being sought in the development of the new contract opportunity to provide comprehensive animal welfare and or bylaw services in the Northern Rockies, and basically we just wanted to facilitate a conversation today. We've outlined some current service levels, capacity challenges, opportunities, and really just hoping to get Council's direction in which way to move forward.
Thank you. Any comments? Councillor Gerwing?
I feel like we're missing two council people that feel pretty passionate about this whole report. And so I'm wondering if it's, I mean, I don't want to waste anybody's time. I'm just wondering if it's better to have this meeting or this discussion at a meeting that they can actually attend, or.
Mr. Barry?
Yeah, no, for sure. So just the intent, well, all council did respond, they were supposed to be here. So the reason for doing this today wasn't necessary to solve all the problems today, but it was to get the discussion started. And it was a good piggyback, honestly, off of the discussions around the bear piece from bylaw perspective also. So it's, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not pertinent that it's done today. We didn't want to have the discussion at a regular council meeting. We figured a special one, which could be at 5 o'clock, just because of the amount of time and potential dialogue that could occur, so that we can have that open dialogue, as Hillary mentioned, and more of a working session with council. What we continue to hear from council is that, you know, the current service isn't adequate from a amount of availability, the type of service that's provided. So we're looking at getting some guidance, and again, future discussion, but just so you can chew on it in the meantime, is looking for guidance in regards to what's that service you're looking at for potentially, and what's the balance between a service provided and a cost perspective, because obviously the more of the service, a larger service costs more money. And then we also looked at in discussions internally was the potential opportunities to increase what that bylaw piece looks like within possibly that contract or another contract, but possibly this one, because if you increase the animal control service times that are available, right, the opportunities that take some pressure off us from a capacity perspective in terms of other bylaw related items that we deal with when it comes to the amount of time that fire, so chief and deputy deal with property maintenance and other issues within the community and the bins and whatnot. If there's a greater level of patrols and timing, maybe we fill some of those gaps with that new one too. So that was just part of the discussion in regards to that. And we thought it was a good opportunity in line with what was discussed here today. Because some of the bylaws that we do have aren't necessarily consistently and adequately enforced just because of the reason that we don't have a dedicated bylaw. Right?
So I guess one of the issues is we don't have any cost in here. We don't know what some of these things will cost when we're discussing gaps here. So, I mean, I think we would all like to have the Cadillac of animal control, but without knowing the cost of it, it's difficult to decide whether for the cost, the benefit the council would like to look at. So, I mean, for myself, I would like to have, you know, some of these gaps filled in, but I don't have the numbers for that, and I don't have the savings to our animal control or our bylaw enforcement, you know, if we did implement some of these things as well, because it would probably be a cost saving there too.
So in terms of pricing out, it's difficult without having the framework around it, because the sky's the limit in terms of what you want to provide. So it's to get an idea where, I mean, I think we all are aware that the more of a service that's provided, the more it's going to cost potentially. So it's to start to get some ideas in terms of what's council looking for, so we can kind of be able to get an understanding what that basic framework or even a range looks like. So then we can go out and start costing, potentially costing out, because it's from a contract perspective. And right now we know what the baseline is, what we currently do, but what would council like to see that's a level of reasonableness? I mean, the Cadillac would be 24/7. Someone calls at 2 o'clock in the morning and then it's Saturday night, and we pick up the phone and we respond like we do with fire, for example, right? But of course, that would be extremely costly. So what are those thoughts around that? We have tracked the times that, from a fire perspective, that we, for example, or what the amount of time that we deal with bylaw and those response times, and that can be provided as part of the discussion also. Cost savings wise, again, it's more around the ability to provide the capacity, and some I could say, like, for instance, with fire, we, you know, a significant amount of bank time potentially gets racked up throughout time because of the amount of requests or responses at time that happen. But the other piece of it also is literally response time, right? It's having the ability to respond to something in a reasonable time, because again, it's from a priority perspective, depending on the situation, something else might take priority over that, or it might be busy. I mean, if the fire department's responding to a call, for example, they can't stop what they're doing there and respond to some other item. So if anything, it was to have the discussion with council to start filling in some of those gaps, to start building the framework so that we can bring that information back for council's review.
So this is going out for a request for proposals, isn't it?
So it'll be a procurement process, which, as Hillary said, that the contract would start in February. So we want to have enough time to be able to get an idea what some of those costs would look like, frame what the service looks like, so we can procure an adequate amount of time, and also then provide the intent would be to provide the appropriate training in the meantime, because the likelihood of having someone, same what we're dealing with currently with the temporary procurement piece for the fill the gap between now and February. Some training would require, because we don't necessarily have individuals in the community that can provide that service that have the proper training. So,
Councilor Gerwin.
Thanks, Mayor. So I'm wondering if we could split these two discussions, because I think the animal welfare services is a separate discussion from bylaw enforcement, like the way my head works. So when you're commenting, are we talking about bylaw enforcement, or are we talking about animal services? So for future, I wonder if we can have them as two separate discussions, because I am 100% in favor of doing a pilot project around a contract position for bylaw enforcement. I would be willing to vote on that today. But the animal services piece, I need more information. I have concerns and questions, and I just see them as two separate issues.
Sure, absolutely. Whichever council wishes. We just looked at what some opportunities were
Yeah.
within it because we thought, here's an example, right? If you go from 40 hours to 140 hours for animal control, if there's patrols that are occurring, there's some other items that could be added to that scope of work. So that's what we looked at. And that was creating some synergies within it versus, well, someone's driving around on a Tuesday evening looking for animals or for dogs or stray cats or dogs. And in the meantime, there's someone else following behind them, tagging or educating people when it comes to bins. So we just thought there might be some opportunities to create some synergies within, but we can separate. I mean, again, the reason for trying to take this approach was to have that dialogue with council so we can start navigating through this to get an understanding, because it's not a black and white approach per se, right? It's that balance between what's a service do you want to provide that's reasonable for the community and what's expected, and what from a cost perspective, what are you also going to pay for it? So we can absolutely take whichever approach council wishes and look at all those opportunities. The intent was not to feel pressured or hurried in a discussion in a regular meeting. So that's why we kind of tacked onto this. We figured we'd have a bit of time and thought we'd have the other councilors here, which unfortunately we don't. But future discussions will be similar. So instead of taking up a significant amount of potential time in a regular, we could look at a special and have that dialogue. So any feedback today we take back, anything in between now and then? Absolutely.
So I would be in favor of what Councillor Gerwin suggests, is separating out the bylaw enforcement part of this. I guess maybe I focus a little bit more on the animal welfare part of this. And I think, we've all talked about amalgamating a lot of the services that are now separated. We would like to get them all under one roof. And I think a combination here of, volunteers working in animal welfare and an organization that's getting some funding from the municipality to provide some services like pound services or collecting animals and doing all this. I think this idea of getting volunteers as well as having a contract for people, I think, is what I'm kind of looking at, where people need to surrender their animals. There's a place to do that. And an organization that makes sure that those animals are kept securely, and if they need to be spayed or neutered, there's some fundraising that goes on in the community, as well as the service they provide to the municipality for going out, rounding up stray dogs, et cetera, and addressing animals in general that they might come across, and working, of course, in conjunction with bylaw enforcement. So this is kind of what I'm thinking of when I see this new project coming forward. Any other comments? Councillor Andrews, Councillor Souls, anything? Councillor Souls.
I see that it's good to have this discussion with it all blended together, in the sense that we have other layers of need for bylaw enforcement that goes way beyond the animal control issue. And so I look at the idea of bylaw enforcement overall. And if you had a person who's dedicated to bylaw enforcement overall, it'd have to be a very well-rounded person that has a very broad understanding of the NRRM and all its components. But I think we could probably keep a person busy doing that. And then that would be the oversight for whatever takes place here as far as animal management. So I see having it all blended has its benefit, because there's no point in having an animal bylaw officer dedicated solely to animal welfare when you're also short of bylaw enforcement on other levels. So go ahead.
Councillor Gerwin.
That's interesting. I wasn't thinking about it in terms of the bylaw enforcement officer being responsible for the animal part. I see.
But why not?
Because I see it as two totally separate things. Like I see bylaw enforcement as a huge job.
Yeah.
Without the animal component, and I see the animal welfare and animal control as another huge component. I think it would be pretty, two very large mandates for one person would be a lot. I kind of saw the animal, because we do have a group in town that's already set up, a not-for-profit. They've done a lot of fundraising. I kind of wondered, for a discussion for another day, is if that doesn't then become, like the mayor said, a group that the municipality funds, but it's community controlled. So like the library or the Phoenix Theater or something like that. Not necessarily following under the bylaw enforcement officer, but I mean, I'm open. I just hadn't considered that.
So I guess the question I've got is, somebody sees a dog running at large. So they phone the municipality. And it's not the bylaw enforcement officer's job to go get the dog. It is this organization's job. However, having your dog running at large is a bylaw infraction. So you would have a bylaw enforcement officer that would be responsible, I guess, for taking any action against somebody whose dog was running at large. So, I think the two of them kind of blend in together, but I don't think a bylaw officer is the one we want having to chase down a dog. That would be the animal control. The enforcement of the bylaw that says you can't have a dog running at large would be the bylaw enforcement's job. As far as organizing this thing, and also I think bylaw enforcement would be enforcing rules like the phone shouldn't be ringing. So, and that would be another infraction. Bylaw enforcement, like. I'm just trying to think of what things we have that have caused us problems in bylaw enforcement or used up a lot of time in the municipality for bylaw. Property maintenance
Property
is one.
maintenance says we're dealing with significant amount of issues now with some of the trailer parks, with some abandoned trailers. We've got animal control does take up our time, even if we have an animal control officer. Sorry? Attractants, yeah.
That's why
Yeah.
Yeah.
The animal thing is big. I'm not sure. I don't know exactly how all these things are done, but I mean, if you drive by a property, the grass is long. You write down the address, you find the owner, you send out a letter. It's not particularly, doesn't take a long time to do that.
Huge amount of time.
Does it?
A huge amount of time. Yeah, we have those numbers, but those are the things that take a significant amount of time because of the process, because it's not just a matter of walking by or writing this down and sending a letter. There's timelines that we have to follow from a legal perspective, what the communication process to the point where we got to think, I'm going to say, go back 3 years is probably the first time this organization has ever acted on a property maintenance issue. Besides a couple of safety ones where a trailer had to be boarded up or something after it's burnt or something like that. But to actually go mow someone's lawn and clean their yard up 3 years ago was probably the first time we ever acted on it. And significant amount of time from the point that we first acknowledge it, communicate what you must do, when you need to have it done by, to the point that we actually go and walk on the property. The amount of time in between, the amount of effort to get to that is extreme. Like extreme.
If I could just add to that a little bit by also suggesting that because it's not a dedicated bylaw enforcement position, that even despite there being a requirement for time to go on in between doing tasks, then the bylaw enforcement officials are also doing a number of other tasks. So it's not dedicated, we're going to handle this at this time, right? It's taking admin time over a span of weeks as they follow up and then do about other business and whatnot. And I also just wanted to add about maybe a little bit of the complexity between having bylaw enforcement as well as animal control. And a common example in other communities, neighboring communities, would be that there might be a contract provided to an animal rescue organization, And that organization, oftentimes we're looking at the SPCA, who has a whole database of resource behind them. And by law, so they'll provide a contract, and then that organization has their own animal control officers and their own volunteer staff and their own ability to access resources. So all I'm suggesting is that in other communities, they are doing both. There is bylaw enforcement. There is also often it's a animal rescue group that is handling a huge component of the animal welfare services, if not all of them, in a community.
Thank you. Councillor Gerwing.
I want to speak to a little bit to the bylaw enforcement and why I got convinced that complaint driven doesn't work is for two reasons. Pitting neighbor against neighbor does not make for a happy community, but also it really sets up this feeling that because I complain about Gerwing's property gets dealt with. But if Gerwing's property doesn't get a complaint against it, then it's just left to do whatever because it's complaint based, right? And so that sense of unfairness, well, why am I being targeted, but Gerwing over there isn't? So that's when I became convinced that we need to have a more formal way to deal with our bylaws. And as you know, I say a million times, we have the bylaws, we have to be able to enforce them.
I think having a dedicated bylaw enforcement officer might actually be a different conversation than how the bylaws are going to be enforced. So if we had a contract bylaw enforcement officer that went out and enforced bylaws without complaints, that's one thing. That's a cost, and that's going through all the things with property checks and so on and so forth, and dealing with animals and so on. If we had still the complaint-driven enforcement procedures, and we had someone on contract, they would only be going out when somebody complained. So I think there may be two different issues here. Mr. Barry.
So just to clarify, so from a property maintenance perspective, we don't base it on complaint driven. We actually actively enforce. That's been direction of council. Similarly, when it comes to dealing with bins and garbage and whatnot, in the bin times when we can, obviously, because from a timing perspective, and that's in coordination also with the WildSafe person that, so Kim, when she goes around, provides a list and feedback to fire. And then the other one is the, oh yeah, perfect. And then water wise, from a watering perspective too, council provided direction that we can actively enforce the water bylaw. The rest, typically, generally, business licenses is another one, yeah, that we actively deal with. The rest is basically from a complaint driven, but it creates its challenges because it does create an inconsistency of the application of the rules. And it's challenging for the community, and it's challenging for us as staff, because then we're going out and dealing with somebody or a group or whatever that might be based on a complaint. But there's another one that's occurring over here that's not being dealt with, and then it creates that inconsistency piece. So agreed. I mean, in terms of the process, it is possibly two separate discussions, but the reality is from a bylaw enforcement and how you enforce them, we typically try to educate and whatnot. But I mean, at the end of the day, the system, I'll say, it doesn't necessarily work the way that we currently do it. Right? It's not adequate from a capacity, from a staffing perspective, and how the bylaws are enforced is challenging based on the complaint driven versus very reactionary versus enforcement. So active enforcement, I'll call it.
Councillor Andrews.
Since we're going along this way, I would not be in favor of sticking with the same bylaw system, enforcement, what we want to call it. I think that as the municipality, we need to go to an active enforcement education, like these 6 bullets on the final page here, I think is something that as a council, we need to be pushing forward. And I think it'll help with a lot of issues within the municipality due to our bylaws.
if I could just add one
Ms.
more
Shepherd,
thing.
go ahead.
Further to your points, Mayor, about recognizing the cost, and then you had referenced volunteers and the group of individuals, Councillor Gerwin did as well, where there are and there was services being provided to the community for a time through the nonprofit group Takashi's. And I think it wasn't until that service wasn't being offered anymore that it really became apparent just how many services they were providing. And so moving forward, it may be a consideration to think about these sort of social outcomes that are happening, and if there's a way to consider or to equate them to what the cost might be when it comes time to looking at community safety or well-being and making a livable community. And if people are having pets and concerned with animal welfare in the community, are the services being offered by nonprofits that maybe weren't typically paid for before by the municipality? Is there a way to consider that in contracts going forward? And it just goes sort of in line with other communities and what nonprofit groups might be doing there. In other cities, we see that sometimes municipalities do engage with donations of land or facilities to further community services. In Dawson Creek, there was a large parcel of land that is now owned by the SPCA for a dog park, just as an example of that type of thing that happens as well.
Thank you. Any other comments? Councillor Souls? Very well, Mr. Berry.
So we'll schedule another meeting and we'll separate the discussion between the animal control piece and bylaw and take it from there. So we'll meet internally, and James just provided, so this would be good information to go into from a grander bylaw perspective in terms of the amount of time and effort that's put into existing bylaw enforcement outside of the animal control side. And then start piecing it together.
Thank you. Very well, seeing as it's 12:58, I'll declare this meeting